a recap of the big stories of 2010, and new laws for the new year. That's up next on Capitol View. Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Capitol View. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and here today to talk to me about Illinois government and politics is Ray Long, State House Bureau Chief for the Chicago Tribune. Ray,
hi, Jamey.
Charlie Wheeler, longtime State House reporter and Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program for University of Illinois at Springfield. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, Jamey.
And Melissa Hahn, State House Bureau Chief for Illinois Radio Network. Melissa, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
We're looking back at some of the big stories in Illinois over the last year, and a lot of people are saying Blagojevich trial. That's made the top of a lot of the lists. I tend to disagree a little. I think maybe the budget and the backlog of bills is the story that perhaps impacts people a little bit more. What are your guys' thoughts on what the biggest story of the year was?
Well, I think that the Blagojevich trial is important in the sense that we convicted a governor, but it's only on one count, and there's more to come. So in that way, it's kind of anticlimactic. And so I view the election as having a big impact on the future of Illinois for many years. The voters decided between two truly different styles. Governor Quinn had proposed up front that there ought to be an income tax increase, and Senator Brady suggested, hey, we could cut our way out of the problems here. There's a huge problem with the budget hole right now, and the two different ideas there were on display for people throughout the state, and they had a true choice this time. A lot of times there are just shades of gray in between some of the positions of the candidates, and now that Governor Quinn is elected and the Democrats retain the majorities in both chambers, there is a good chance that the Democrats will control every piece of the reapportionment process. And for folks who think that's a little too arcane, that means how the districts will be drawn for the next 10 years. And basically, it has a big impact on who your state rep will be for the next 10 years, too.
So voters' choice in the election might be the biggest story of the year because it'll impact the legislature for maybe 10 years to come.
It has a big future impact on what will happen here. And you know, when the legislature turns Democratic, you can see more advance in social change, as we've seen in the past since Blagojevich actually took office in 2003. There were many social issues that were on the back burner for years when the Senate Republicans were in charge of the Senate. So we've seen a shift, and now we've seen things like civil unions pass this year that couldn't have passed years before. And with this Democratic majority, we will see more advances in social issues.
So the adage in Illinois that it always comes back to the election, it's always politics, that rings true this year as well. We were talking a little bit about Illinois making national news for our budget troubles a little bit before the show. Any thoughts on where we stand here looking at the end of the year, comparing us to other states, and how we're going to get out of this? Charlie, what do you think about the budget deficit as a story of the year?
I guess in a sense it could be the story of the year, but it could have been the story of the last year and the story of the year before. We've been on this long spiral of continuing to spend more money than we have coming in. And as a matter of fact, if you look at it in the sense of funding for the pensions, it goes back literally decades. Probably ever since I started paying attention to this, longer ago than I care to admit, the legislature and governors have always been faced with the problem there are more needs out there than we have resources for. And they've chosen to ignore or undercut the future need of the retirement systems to be able to spend those dollars on current needs, education, human services, other worthwhile programs, because the state just doesn't take in enough money to be able to pay for all the things that voters say they want. And so the situation has reached almost the breaking point in the fact that by some reckoning, the state obligations, the money that the state owes but can't come up with, is more than half of what the state's operating budget is, which puts us in the worst shape of any state in the union. And the question is, when will the legislature decide that enough is enough and we have to take some radical steps, probably raising revenues? The sensible thing in my judgment would be to increase the income tax rates, maybe broaden the sales tax base so that our revenue structure matches the modern economy, and at the same time cut back on some of the costly programs. But as I said, the public doesn't seem to be, what's the right word, doesn't seem to be fully cognizant of what the problem is, because you see survey after survey where people say, we don't want to pay any more taxes. You got to rein in spending. Okay, well, we'll cut education. Oh, no, don't cut education. We'll cut human services. Oh, don't want to do that. How about healthcare? No, we don't want to do that. And so basically people want to nibble around the edges to come up with billions and billions of dollars. And the math just doesn't work.
What will it take? I mean, we've discussed this a lot on previous shows. What will it take? I mean, the story was on, I looked at some of people's top 10s today. It was in the top 5 of most of them, the budget shortfall and the backlog of unpaid bills. So it's clearly getting a lot of exposure. What will it take for people to wrap their heads around this problem?
I think part of the problem is it is such a broad topic, and it affects so many people in their daily lives, but not everybody in their daily lives. You talk to someone who is a social service provider in a small community that hasn't been paid, that's a top issue for them. But you talk to the college student about what's important, especially when it comes to the budget, they always think higher education. So people have this rather myopic view of how bad the state's finances are in, and it's always based on what is in their viewfinder. So for those people who don't see it as this crush of debt as we see it every day, I think they look at those more splash in the pan issues like Blagojevich, the things that hit the national television, and now that this issue of the budget crisis has started to hit the national TV programs, it's starting to get some notice, because of course we've been covering this budget issue for as many years as this has been going on. But it seems like there's a whole new rush of news stories. As soon as someone can quote from one of the national television programs or perhaps a Washington Post, then all of a sudden everybody's taking a much more deep look at it. Shoot, the Washington Post says we're awful, or whoever, I'm making this up, whatever show, they say we're awful. Then there's a whole new rush of stories. And I think that will bring it a little closer to home. I still think, and I think I've said this for 2 years, it won't be until you can directly trace, say, and I hate to say this out loud, but a death to social services being cut or some other just horrendous tragedy that can be directly related to the budget. I think people will say, oh, that's awful. The state should really get its fiscal house in order. What's for dinner? I just think it's a broad issue. It's a complicated issue. It takes in all sorts of things, from tax increases to the sales tax base and what do we put a sales tax on, what do we not, federal money, et cetera. That's a lot for somebody to keep track of.
Well, and I think people look at the federal debt and see, that being not actually limitless, but we feel like it is, and not realizing that it's different on the state level, that we can't do that.
We can't print money, so there is a finite end to this.
And I think what Melissa says is true in the sense that it's going to take some horrible tragedy before the average citizen starts to pay more attention. But what I find, what would you say, disappointing, is that I find it difficult to believe that any of the 177 members of the General Assembly don't understand what the problem is. If somebody stands up and says, oh, I have no clue, that person should resign on the spot. They are our elected representatives. They're supposed to be the ones who are devoting their time to study these issues that average citizens don't have time to keep up with. And they're the ones who are supposed to have the courage, the political will to make the tough decisions to right the ship of state. And so far, they've abdicated. Now, I would qualify that by saying the Illinois Senate did in 2009 pass an income tax increase, broaden the sales tax base, provide additional tax relief to middle and low income taxpayers that would generate maybe $6-7 billion, which would put the state on the right track to be able to meet its obligations. That bill languishes in the House. There's been some rumbling that it may get called this coming week in the waning days of the current legislative session. That remains to be seen. But I'll go back to what I said. I blame the legislature for not having the courage to do the right thing, whatever they think the right thing is.
Well, and Melissa, when you talked a little bit about personal stories and people connecting with personal stories, it made me think of another big story of the year, which was MGT Push, and there were some tragic stories that came out of prisoners that were released and some violence that occurred after they had been released. It didn't connect with voters as much as Brady maybe had hoped that it would during the last election, but what are some of the legacy of the MGT Push scandal? Ray, I mean, what do you think are we looking at in the future that this might affect?
Well, one of the legacies right now is that they've shut down a lot of the releases, and the prison population is growing. So there may be people who should be released now who are not getting released because they are afraid to release them because it could be a political disaster or something like that. The program itself had all kinds of red flags. The idea that we could save money by releasing prisoners early just was kind of a softball headed toward home plate of disaster, and it turned out to be problematic in many, many ways.
But then, as you said, it's kind of come back around. The program that was escalated, that was releasing prisoners faster than we typically have in the past, was shut down, but also the regular program that is been used for years to release people early, was also shut down. So that may cause some issues for the prison system in the future.
And being the crisis state that we are, where we only react to problems and not prevent problems, AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, the state's largest employees union, says that prisons are at 148% capacity. So there again, if we get so large in our prison population that there is a riot, and I don't know how long it's been, but I know I've covered one in my lifetime, not at one, but there was one in my lifetime. You get something like that, or God forbid a guard be killed on the job, then you know that'll be the disaster, and that's when everyone will come out and say, see, we said we should have been careful about how many prisoners are in our facilities. But there again, it's going to take another crisis.
Well, then you've got really another great example of how they can't really get their priorities straight. They've got a big prison sitting up in Thompson, Illinois, just off the Mississippi River, that is empty. They've tried to sell it to the federal government. They don't have the ability to run it because they don't want to spend the money to staff it. So then we've got prisoners stacked on top of prisoners in other places, which shouldn't be the case, but yet they don't want to put them into a prison where they could relieve this problem, and that's all because of money. So money, money, money is what's happening here. Everywhere you turn, decisions are being driven by money, and not all the times for the better of the public.
And as Charlie said before, the pension system has been shorted for decades. Too many administrations and too many legislatures have put a priority on what projects can I stand at the ribbon cutting ceremony for, rather than, gee, what's our prison system population and how do we short that up? So bottom line is, too many administrations and legislatures have cheated kind of the infrastructure, the nuts and bolts of state government operations, in order to favor themselves in terms of publicity and ribbon cuttings, et cetera. And now it's really coming back to haunt us.
And there's been the idea of that we can sell off some of this infrastructure and nuts and bolts now that we are facing some crisis time, as it were.
The irony about the whole prison thing is that back in the 70s and in the early 80s, there were some changes made in the laws, one of which was to go to something called determinate sentencing, which required prisoners to stay in the prison system longer. We also declared a war on drugs and started locking up people for nonviolent drug offenses, and our prison population skyrocketed. We built something like 20 plus prisons over a 25 year period, and today the prisons are more crowded than they were back in the early 70s, and the budget has like sextupled from a couple $100 million to well over $1 billion to run the prison system, and we still have more people. And the side that people don't think about. When you talked about the early release, people got out early, they committed crimes, and everybody got upset. The reality is that people who serve their full sentence and are released, half of them will be back within 3 years because they've committed crimes. So we don't have the funds to put in the kind of programs that might help some people who are able to be rehabilitated to get the vocational training they need, to get the education they need, to get the kind of psychological counseling, dealing with drug addiction or alcohol, that would enable that person to function once they're released. Instead, because we can't provide these programs, we kind of warehouse people and then throw them out the door when their time is up and say, we'll see you in a couple years.
Well, and I think it's hard to discuss that reality that if you don't want to lock people up and throw away the key, people are going to reoffend. There's going to be these stories that hurt people in elections, that hurt families. It's difficult, it seems, for us in Illinois to talk about what our priorities are when it comes to corrections. We can talk about public safety, but when it comes to corrections, we seem to have a ways to go to sort
and
that out.
And we can't afford to lock people up and throw the key away. We're finding out.
That's true. Another really big story, especially for Chicago, was Mayor Daley announcing his retirement.
Sure.
Ray, can you talk about that a little bit? You're a Chicago expert.
Well, I covered Mayor Daley for a few years ago in City Hall, and he's evolved over the years from a mayor who just was trying to get elected to get in the door to a guy who could give a little bit of vision to a city that has benefited from it. Now, we've seen things like his vision with Governor Edgar to open another airport, Lake Calumet on the south side. That didn't go over too well. But then on the other hand, you've seen the idea of putting in Millennium Park, which has been an international hit, and anybody who hasn't gone there will see that it's glorious and a great place to go.
It's a lovely bean. I love the bean.
The bean, of course. Of course, the cost was wildly over estimates. And then Mayor Daley will be remembered too for being a guy who did various things to try to fight crime, but in a big city like Chicago, it's very tough to stem the whole problem that you have in a big city. You'll see things like programs that come into place, but he tried neighborhood policing and a variety of things that have worked in different areas, and when you have the right people involved in these things. But he's run up against the money tree too, and now Chicago is facing a big budget problem, and he's even had to dip into reserves that they didn't think that they'd have to tap for years, and they got those reserves by having basically selling off or renting away or giving the rights to various places like the Skyway and going to Indiana. Mayor Daley also will be remembered, of course, as the guy who, once the clock hit midnight and a deal was over to keep Meigs Field open, he sent the bulldozers out and put X's right through the runway, and no planes could land there and no planes that were there could take off either. So he had a lot of a type of authoritarian style. He's the kind of guy who can yell and scream and want something done now, but he was also a coalition builder who could reach out to different communities, whereas he saw the addition as a political plus. His father ran a city that was iron fist and had more division throughout ethnic communities and racial communities, and it's a big contrast in style.
Charlie, do you have any thoughts? You worked for the Sun-Times for many years, and is there anything you'd like to add about Daley's time in office?
Well, he now has served longer than his father did, and he will, as Ray said, he will go down, I think, as being much more of a visionary than his father was in terms of envisioning the beautification of the city, being able to build coalitions, and he did it without the kind of tools that his father had that enabled him to be so authoritarian. His father was the chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party. They controlled jobs, they controlled patronage, contracts to a much greater extent than we've seen since that time. And yet, the son was able to do some things that the father wasn't able to do. And he had a vision that extended beyond the city itself, in the sense that he was a world traveler. And he would see an idea that he liked somewhere, and he would bring it back and try and do it in Chicago. And no one would ever have accused his father of that.
Well, I'd like to move on a little to some of the new laws that will be going into effect January 1st. We've talked a lot about the pension system, the reforms to the pension system that will change benefits for people who are hired after January 1 will kick in. There's been some talk that we should look at changing pension benefits for people who already are working for the state. It looks like that's probably not going to fly anytime soon. But can we outline just a little about what some of those changes are going to be that are coming up in January? Melissa, are you aware of some of those?
Yes, the new system, this new lower level, a lower tier of benefits will affect folks who are hired from January 1st after. They will have to work longer. They will get less in their pension because when you calculate your pension amount, you will look at a greater amount of time. So instead of, say, your highest 4 years, I believe they'll look at 8 years. So in theory, unless they start approving a lot of raises there in the last 8 years, then those amounts will go down. This is supposed to save the state, depending on what day you ask Governor Pat Quinn, I think between $2 and $3 billion. It is a change that is was absolutely necessary, and as Charlie said, this was an actual chance for the legislature to do something that was smart for years to come. Of course, the unions were not thrilled about it. We're looking at another possible change. The lawmakers passed, and we're awaiting action by the governor on a similar lower tier for police and firefighters. That is also supposed to save money, but that's on the local level. So that's a long-range kind of issue that I think is one of the lawmakers' greatest accomplishments in the last couple of years, along with campaign finance reform, because they did it not just for the headlines the day after. This was something that was good for state government for many years to come.
And in some cases, I think they would have preferred there not been headlines the day after, because it was passed very quickly through both chambers in a single day. But you did make the point, and one of the representatives of the Firemen's Union said this as well. They weren't thrilled with the changes, but they were glad that the pension system is going to maintain, keep going and be soluble, hopefully, in the future. So,
right.
Charlie, you've kept track of the pension systems for a while now. Is this enough? What was your take on this when it happened?
Well, it's going to save the state a lot of money. I think the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability had their actuaries take a look at it, and over the next 30 years, 35 years, I guess, it will save in excess of $70 billion in terms of what the state would have had to contribute for its share of these pension costs. And the savings obviously are going to be greater at the far end when more of the workforce is covered by this second tier pension provisions rather than right now, because right now it doesn't affect anybody. It will starting January 1st. I guess right now it would, though, because we're probably past January 1st, right? I'm getting mixed up here on the timing.
No, we won't be. Yeah.
And it will take all that time for those folks to actually get a benefit.
Before
sure.
you're
in
entitled to
theory,
anything.
20 years beyond that.
But it will save money that way. You mentioned the fact of there are people who argue that, well, we should do the same thing to current employees. I have a conflict of interest because I'm an employee of the University of Illinois.
As do I. So.
Yeah.
Me too, because I worked for the state for a while.
Should I ever decide to retire, this could affect me. But looking at it, conflict aside, it just doesn't seem to me that it makes any sense to try and go after the current employees for the simple reason that the Constitution guarantees those benefits. Now, there are people who argue and say, well, we got a legal opinion that says you can do it. I would point out that whatever position you want, you should be able to find a lawyer who, for the appropriate fee, will provide you with the legal reasoning. And that's not a knock on lawyers. That's what their job is. They're supposed to be able to come up and represent any side of a case. That's what they're trained to do. And so, yeah, you could trot somebody out and says, oh, yeah, you can do this. It would certainly be challenged in court. The judges that would consider it, the justices that would weigh in on it, are all part of the pension system also, because the judges' pension system is in there. So I think what we've done is about as much as we can do. And a flip side that's come up, there is some concern that if you reduce the benefits payable under a system below a certain level, then the federal government will no longer allow you to have your own system as a government. And they'll say, okay, you got to start doing Social Security. And the federal government does not allow you to take a pension holiday and not pay money into the Social Security fund. Mm-hmm. In fact, there have been some estimates that said, were the state to do away with a defined benefit and go to a defined contribution system, it would be more costly, because you would have to pay Social Security, plus you would have to put money in as part of the state's contribution to this type of a system. And you could wind up actually spending more than you do with what we have now, particularly with the changes to reduce the future costs.
I have a final question for you on the pensions. Charlie, looking at getting this passed, it wasn't the easiest thing for the Democrats to do. Is there any concern once we make a recovery as a state that the legislature may go back in and change again and up the pension benefits? Is that something they should consider doing if things get better?
Oh, sure. I mean, no legislature is able to put something in stone that will last forever. They could come back and change it, day after tomorrow. I don't think they will, but there will certainly the public employee unions will be arguing, do we really want to have teachers who are 67 years old working with kindergartners? They've already made that argument. And if in fact the state runs the risk of falling below the minimum threshold to be exempt from Social Security, then we may have to adjust the benefit levels up so that we don't wind up having to pay Social Security for teachers.
So any final thoughts on the year, Melissa?
Well, of course, we have that ban on purchasing monkeys as pets. I think that is, we've all been waiting with bated breath for that law.
Charlie, we have about 30 seconds left. Any final thoughts on the year?
It was an exciting year, and the coming year is even going to be more exciting.
Ray?
I just think we'll find out whether politicians will put themselves and their politics ahead of the people, or whether they'll have the courage to do things that are tough and make those moves. And we'll see, because this will be a year where their mettle will be tested. Well,
I'd like to thank Ray Long, Charlie Wheeler, and Melissa Hahn for joining me, and I wish you a very happy new year. Thanks for tuning in to Capitol View.